The dawn light broke slowly over the rolling hills surrounding the fortified city of Vienna in September of the year 1683. A thick mist clung to the ground, obscuring the view of the terrified sentries standing watch atop the stone walls. Below them lay a sight that would freeze the blood of any observer, as thousands of tents stretched across the landscape like a canvas of white and green. This was the encampment of the massive Ottoman army, which had marched hundreds of miles to capture the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. The silence of the morning was broken only by the distant call to prayer and the rhythmic pounding of siege drums. Inside the city walls, the situation was becoming desperate for the beleaguered defenders and the starving civilian population. Food supplies had dwindled to dangerously low levels, and clean water was becoming a luxury that few could afford. Disease was rampant in the crowded streets, where the stench of death mingled with the smoke of gunpowder. Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, the military commander of Vienna, walked the ramparts with a heavy heart. He knew that his crumbling fortifications could not hold out against the Ottoman sappers much longer. The constant explosions from underground mines shook the very foundations of the city and tested the resolve of every soldier. The stakes of this confrontation were higher than just the fate of a single city or even an empire. Vienna was widely considered the golden apple of Christianity and the gateway to Western Europe. If the city fell to the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, the road to Rome and the rest of the continent would be wide open. The Ottoman ambition was not merely territorial but ideological, aiming to expand the domain of Islam into the heart of Christendom. The monarchs of Europe watched in horror as the Habsburg capital teetered on the brink of total collapse. The entire geopolitical balance of the known world hung by a thread. At the center of this gathering storm stood the ambitious Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, who commanded the Ottoman forces. He was a man of immense power and drive who sought to surpass the achievements of his predecessors by claiming the ultimate prize. His tent was a palace of silk and gold erected within sight of the besieged city, where he directed the bombardment with ruthless efficiency. Kara Mustafa believed that destiny was on his side and that the fragmented Christian nations were too weak to unite against him. He had gambled everything on this campaign, including his own life and the prestige of the Ottoman dynasty. But a question lingered in the minds of both the besiegers and the besieged as the days turned into weeks. Would the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I manage to rally a relief force in time to save his capital? The politics of Europe were fractured by religious wars and ancient rivalries, making a unified coalition seem like an impossible dream. The defenders of Vienna looked to the Kahlenberg Heights every day, hoping to see the banners of a rescue army. They wondered if they had been abandoned to their fate, or if a miracle would descend from the hills to break the iron grip of the Ottoman siege lines. To understand how two great empires arrived at this apocalyptic moment, we must look back nearly 2 centuries to the plains of Hungary. The conflict between the House of Habsburg and the Ottoman Empire was not a sudden eruption, but a slow-burning fire that had consumed generations. It began in earnest after the fall of Constantinople, when the Ottoman sultans turned their gaze northward toward the Danube River. The Kingdom of Hungary stood as the buffer zone between the expanding Islamic power in the east and the Christian kingdoms of the west. This borderland would become a graveyard for thousands of soldiers. The year 1526 marked the beginning of the end for independent Hungary and the start of direct conflict between Vienna and Constantinople. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, a ruler of immense vision and military genius, led his army north to the field of Mohacs. Opposing him was the young King Louis II of Hungary, who led a brave but outnumbered force of knights and infantry. The Battle of Mohacs was a catastrophe for the Hungarians, resulting in the death of their king and the destruction of their medieval kingdom. This power vacuum drew the Habsburgs directly into the path of the Ottoman war machine. With the death of King Louis II, the Hungarian crown was claimed by Ferdinand I of Habsburg, the brother of the Holy Roman Emperor. This claim placed the Habsburg dynasty in direct competition with Sultan Suleiman, who considered Hungary his by right of conquest. The two powers were now locked in a struggle for dominance over Central Europe that would last for centuries. The border between their domains became a militarized zone known as the military frontier, where raids and skirmishes were a daily reality. It was a place where peace was merely a temporary pause in an endless war. Suleiman the Magnificent was not content with merely holding the southern parts of Hungary. In the year 1529, he launched his first attempt to capture Vienna and strike a death blow to the Habsburgs. The weather proved to be his greatest enemy, as torrential rains turned the roads into mud pits and bogged down his heavy siege cannons. The First Siege of Vienna ended in an Ottoman withdrawal, but it established a terrifying precedent. The citizens of Vienna knew that the Sultan would return and that their city was the ultimate target of Ottoman expansion. Following the failure of 1529, the conflict settled into a stalemate of fortress warfare and diplomatic maneuvering. The Habsburgs built a complex system of fortifications along the border manned by local militias and professional soldiers. These border guards lived in a constant state of alert, knowing that an Ottoman raiding party could appear at any moment. The Ottomans in turn established their own network of garrisons and used local proxies to harass Habsburg lands. This era of the Little War was characterized by ambushes and slave raids rather than massive pitched battles. The cultural clash between the two empires was as intense as the military one. The Ottomans brought with them the Islamic faith, the Turkish language, and a highly centralized bureaucratic system. The Habsburgs championed Catholicism and the feudal traditions of Europe. Yet despite their enmity, there was also a strange intimacy between the two rivals. Diplomats traveled back and forth, exchanging gifts and negotiating truces. Merchants crossed the lines to trade spices and textiles. Even the soldiers on the frontier developed a grudging respect for the fighting skills of their adversaries. By the mid-16th century, the Ottoman Empire had reached the zenith of its power under Suleiman. His fleets dominated the Mediterranean, and his armies seemed invincible on land. The Habsburgs under Emperor Charles V were stretched thin, fighting wars against France and dealing with the Protestant Reformation. It seemed that nothing could stop the Ottoman advance. However, the sheer size of the Ottoman Empire began to work against it. Supply lines became overextended, and the campaigning season was limited by the onset of winter. The death of Suleiman the Magnificent in 1566 during the Siege of Vienna marked a turning point. While the empire remained a superpower, the era of rapid expansion began to slow. The subsequent sultans were often less capable military leaders, and the internal politics of the harem began to influence state decisions. However, the military threat to the Habsburgs remained potent. The Ottoman war machine was still capable of mobilizing vast resources and manpower that the Austrians struggled to match. The Long War, which erupted in 1593 and lasted until 1606, demonstrated the changing nature of the conflict. This exhausting struggle featured improved European firearms and fortifications that neutralized the traditional Ottoman advantages. The Janissaries, the elite shock troops of the Sultan, found themselves suffering heavy casualties against disciplined Habsburg musketeers. The war ended with the Peace of Zitvatorok, which was significant because it treated the Holy Roman Emperor and the Ottoman Sultan as equals for the first time in diplomatic history. The 17th century brought new challenges for both empires as they grappled with internal strife and external enemies. The Habsburgs were consumed by the devastation of the 30 Years' War, which tore through the Holy Roman Empire. The Ottomans faced rebellions in Anatolia and wars with Safavid Persia. For a time, the Danube frontier remained relatively quiet as both giants licked their wounds. But the memory of past conflicts and the desire for glory never truly faded from the minds of the ambitious leaders on both sides. The rise of the Kurpulu era in the Ottoman Empire brought a resurgence of military vigor and administrative discipline. A series of capable grand viziers from the Kurpulu family ruthlessly purged corruption and revitalized the army. They believed that the only way to restore the empire to its former glory was through conquest. Their eyes turned once again to the west and the unfinished business with the House of Habsburg. This renewed aggression set the stage for the climactic showdown that would unfold in 1683. This brings us back to the tent of Kara Mustafa Pasha outside the walls of Vienna. The Grand Vizier had assembled one of the largest armies in Ottoman history, fueled by the belief that the Habsburgs were weak and divided. He ignored the warnings of his commanders, who advised him to focus on capturing border fortresses first. Kara Mustafa wanted the ultimate prize, and he was willing to risk everything to get it. His sappers dug intricate networks of tunnels to undermine the Viennese walls, while his artillery kept the defenders pinned down. Inside Vienna, the situation had passed from desperate to critical. The commander, Count Starhemberg, was suffering from dysentery, but refused to leave his post. He ordered the last rations to be distributed and prepared the citizens for street fighting. The walls were breached in several places, and only makeshift barricades stood between the Ottomans and the city center. The defenders fought with the fury of men who knew that surrender meant death or enslavement. Every hour bought with blood was a prayer for salvation. Unknown to the defenders, a massive relief coalition was finally gathering in the woods near the Danube. The Polish King Jan Sobieski had answered the call of the Pope and marched his formidable army to join forces with the imperial troops. It was a rare moment of unity in a fractured Europe, driven by the realization that the fall of Vienna would be a catastrophe for all. Sobieski was a seasoned warrior who had fought the Ottomans before and knew their tactics intimately. On the morning of September 12, 1683, the Ottoman troops preparing for the final assault were stunned to see the hills of the Kahlenberg fill with soldiers. The relief army had arrived. Kara Mustafa was caught off guard, having failed to secure his rear flank. He hastily ordered his troops to form a defensive line, but his army was now trapped between the city defenders and the fresh coalition forces. The stage was set for one of the largest cavalry charges in the history of warfare. The battle began slowly with infantry skirmishes clearing the vineyards and rough terrain of the foothills. The German and Austrian infantry pushed the Ottoman lines back, steadily grinding down their resistance. Kara Mustafa watched with growing anxiety as his defensive positions collapsed one by one. He tried to rally his men, but the momentum had shifted. The Ottoman soldiers, tired from months of siege and demoralized by the sudden appearance of the enemy, began to waver. As the sun began to lower in the afternoon sky, King Jan Sobieski saw his opportunity. He ordered the charge of the Winged Hussars, the heavy cavalry, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. 18,000 horsemen, the largest cavalry charge in history, thundered down the hills. The sound was like a rolling earthquake, and the sight of the winged riders terrified the Ottoman conscripts. They smashed into the Ottoman lines with unstoppable force, shattering their formations and causing panic to spread like wildfire. The Ottoman resistance collapsed completely under the weight of the Hussar charge. Kara Mustafa fled the battlefield, leaving behind his magnificent tent, his treasury, and the sacred standard of the Prophet. The Siege of Vienna was broken. The defenders poured out of the city gates to join the slaughter and loot the abandoned camp. It was a crushing defeat for the Ottomans and a miraculous victory for the Habsburgs and their allies. The threat to Western Europe had been neutralized in a single afternoon. The aftermath of the Battle of Vienna was immediate and severe for the Grand Vizier. Kara Mustafa Pasha was executed in Belgrade on the orders of the Sultan, paying the ultimate price for his failure. For the Ottoman Empire, the defeat marked the end of its expansion into Europe. The myth of Ottoman invincibility was shattered forever. The initiative had passed to the Habsburgs, who would now go on the offensive to reclaim the lands lost over the previous centuries. The years following the victory at Vienna were known as the Great Turkish War. The Holy League, consisting of the Holy Roman Empire, Poland, Venice, and Russia, launched a coordinated attack on Ottoman territories. The Habsburg armies, led by brilliant commanders like Prince Eugene of Savoy, pushed deep into Hungary and the Balkans. They liberated Buda, which had been under Ottoman rule for 145 years. The tide of history had turned decisively. The Battle of Zenta in 1697 was the final nail in the coffin for the Ottoman efforts to regain lost ground. Prince Eugene of Savoy caught the Ottoman army crossing the Tisza River and annihilated it. The Sultan himself barely escaped with his life. This crushing defeat forced the Ottoman Empire to sue for peace. The resulting Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 was a humiliation for the Porte and a triumph for Vienna. The Treaty of Karlowitz forced the Ottoman Empire to cede vast territories, including all of Hungary and Transylvania, to the Habsburgs. It was the first time the Ottomans had signed a treaty as a defeated power, acknowledging the loss of integral provinces. The border moved hundreds of miles to the south, and the Habsburg monarchy emerged as a dominant great power in Europe. The centuries of defensive warfare were replaced by an era of Austrian confidence and expansion. For the people living in these contested lands, the shift in power brought mixed blessings. The departure of the Ottomans meant the return of Christian rule, but also the imposition of heavy taxes and religious intolerance by the Habsburg administration. Many Hungarians who had chafed under the Sultan now found themselves rebelling against the emperor. The region remained a volatile melting pot of cultures and religions, scarred by centuries of continuous warfare. The 18th century saw further conflicts between the two empires, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. The Ottoman Empire was now the sick man of Europe, struggling to hold onto its possessions, while the Habsburgs faced new rivals in the West like Prussia and France. The wars became less about existential survival and more about border adjustments and power politics. The fanatical religious zeal of the early conflicts slowly gave way to cold geopolitical calculations. Despite the bloodshed, the long contact between the Ottomans and Habsburgs left a lasting cultural legacy. The introduction of coffee to Vienna after the siege gave birth to the famous Viennese coffee house culture. Ottoman musical instruments influenced European military bands, and Turkish motifs became fashionable in Austrian art and architecture. The two empires, though locked in combat, had shaped each other in profound ways. They were mirror images reflecting the complexities of East and West. The military innovations driven by these wars transformed the art of warfare. The Habsburgs developed a sophisticated system of border defense and light infantry tactics to counter the Ottoman raiders. The Ottomans were forced to modernize their artillery and firearms to keep pace with European technology. This arms race drove advancements that would influence military thinking well into the modern era. The plains of Hungary had served as a brutal laboratory for the evolution of combat. As we look back on this era of conflict, we see more than just a list of battles and treaties. We see the struggle of human beings caught in the gears of history. We see the terrified families in border villages, the ambitious viziers dreaming of glory, and the stoic soldiers dying in the mud for emperors they would never meet. The Ottoman and Habsburg wars were a crucible that forged the national identities of Central and Eastern Europe. The physical scars of the conflict can still be seen today in the ruined fortresses that dot the landscape of Hungary and the Balkans. The monuments in Vienna and the tombs in Istanbul tell the story of a rivalry that defined an epoch. It is a reminder of how fragile civilization can be and how quickly the fortunes of great powers can rise and fall. The golden apple was saved, but the cost was paid in blood and iron. In the end, both empires would eventually collapse in the fires of the First World War centuries later. They would fall within weeks of each other, ending the dynasties of Osman and Habsburg forever. But for hundreds of years, their duel determined the fate of millions and drew the map of the modern world. The echo of their cannons still resonates in the history books and the cultural DNA of the nations they left behind. The story of the Ottoman and Habsburg Wars is a testament to the enduring nature of human conflict and the resilience of the human spirit. It serves as a powerful lesson on the consequences of imperial ambition and the clash of civilizations. As the sun sets over the Danube today, it shines on a peaceful river that once ran red with the blood of empires. The whisper of time tells us that while empires may vanish, the history they create remains eternal.